Welcome back, everyone. If you are joining us from the prior session, if not, welcome to our day one Critical Access Hospital virtual conference, the sixth annual for Stroudwater. Our next session is called CAH Strategic Risk, Moving from Vulnerability to Sustainability, with Jeff Summer and Amy Graham. Our next session shifts from workforce challenges, which we just talked about, to organizational sustainability and strategic risk. The rural hospitals closure rarely happens overnight. Most often, it is the result of mounting financial, operational, workforce, and strategic pressures that increase vulnerability over time. In this session, Jeff Summer, who's managing director here at Stroudwater Associates, and Amy Graham, who's a principal at Stroudwater, will walk through updated national analysis on CAH closure risk, the characteristics of hospitals most at risk, and importantly, the real-world strategies that organizations are using to strengthen their long-term sustainability. Through his work with rural hospitals across the country, Jeff has helped leadership teams navigate financial pressure, workforce instability, service line challenges, and long-term strategic planning during periods of significant change. And then Amy is our principal with our revenue cycle, who has done great work with a lot of rural hospitals around the country. And participants will also hear practical examples of how rural hospitals are addressing margin pressure, workforce gaps, service line stability, and governance challenges to move from risk exposure toward greater resilience. So with that, please take it away, Jeff and Amy.
Thanks, Keith.
Terrific, Keith. Thank you. Let me just quickly look at something here. I don't know that I've shared my screen. I apologize. There we are.
Yeah, it takes a
Coming
minute.
up.
And it should go to screen mode here, or presentation mode. Is it in presentation mode, Amy?
No, sir.
Okay. There we go. Well, thank you, Keith. Amy and I are very pleased to be here with you today. And what we're going to do is really get into the why pretty quickly. And
Jeff,
the importance of this conversation.
hey, Jeff,
Yes.
you are sharing presenter mode, not the PowerPoint deck itself. Just wanted to catch that.
Oh yeah, can you make it
Maybe.
Sorry. There we go. That should be better.
Let's see. And we wait.
there
We go. Perfect. Thank you.
Sorry about that. This tells the story of what's happened in this country, rural hospital closures since 2010. This is a great infographic that our team has put together, building off of Shep Center data. And you can see there's been obviously a concerning trend on rural hospital closures and conversions, with REH becoming an option in the more recent years. But you can see that there's been a just steady trend, concerningly moving upward, although perhaps moderating in 2025 somewhat, and also 2026 year to date. Texas leads the nation in terms of the number of closures, but a number of states are not far behind. And this really was what created the need in our mind for better optics into closure. Specifically, what we wanted to do was assist hospital boards, hospital C-suite with the knowledge they'd need to anticipate and diagnose risks of closure and strategic risk well in advance. So we wanted to help people understand what the trajectory of closed hospitals, rural hospitals, looks like during the years prior, and trying to give folks as long a runway as possible on that. Looking at the trajectory of how closed hospitals compared to open rural hospitals, and seeing what can we learn from the difference in those trajectories and that experience prior to closure. What are some of the key differentiators, risk factors that indicate closure is an issue for rural hospitals? And importantly, look at those hospitals that have thrived during this period, in particular pre-pandemic 2019 through post-pandemic 2024. What can those organizations tell us about strategies and tactics and risk factors that can be addressed for all the rural hospitals that are facing what is a rapidly evolving and risky environment? We wanted to start by acknowledging the work that the North Carolina Rural Health Research Program has done, in particular, George Pink and his team. They've developed a very robust statistical model that predicted closure and financial distress 2 years out. And there's a link to that study and a bibliography in the appendix of this slide deck. And their work is very robust. It's statistically significant, peer-reviewed academic research. But in that attribute lies perhaps a limitation, which is the sophistication of the statistical analysis makes it less accessible, less actionable, in our opinion, for practitioners, C-suite, board members to understand. The other issue that we wanted to address in our work was 2 years prior to closure is really not enough runway for C-suite to affect change. And so we really wanted to make sure that folks could benefit from a longer set of perspectives and insights. And so that's why we arrived at, you can see here this chart, and it really presents a lot of data. I'll walk you through it. We'll present some more of these later in the study, or excuse me, later in the presentation. We continue to work on this study and anticipate it will be published later in 2026. But this particular chart is a great way for us to get grounded in the analysis. So what we're looking is at total cash flow margin for rural hospitals. This is all rural hospitals. The gold line is the median for those hospitals that remained open as of 2024. So throughout the study period, they're open. The blue line is the median for those hospitals that closed at some point in the study. And you can see at the bottom there, we've got a series of negative numbers. On the far right, it's -1 all the way back to -10. These are the years prior to closure. So for the hospitals that closed, we normalized around year of closure, which became year 0. So each year has a cohort, and each year closure years cohort, 2019, 2018, 2017, there's a set of hospitals that have year -1 assigned to them. And the same thing applies for all of those years. For the relevant closure cohort, we then compared their year -1. So for example, if the hospital closed in 2019, year -1 is 2018. We then compared year -1 for that cohort to 2018 for the hospitals that were opened, and looked at the differential and looked at the actual data. And we layered each cohort on top of itself. So we have essentially 15 cohorts that have a year -1, and that compares to the corresponding chronological year that is year -1 for each of those cohorts. And that way we normalized for year of closure and provided a way to look at the trajectory and compare hospitals that closed, the median for hospitals that closed, against the median for hospitals that were open in the appropriate year relative to year of closure. So that's quite important. I will also add, we deleted years 2020 and 2021 from the data set. So whichever years -1 through -10, or in this case, it would really be no earlier than year -5, that were 2020 and 2021 would not be included in the data set. And that was because the pandemic years created such noise in terms of operating results, operating performance. You had the disruption of the pandemic, and then you also had the disruption or noise associated with pandemic relief funds. So that has been removed from this. What I will add is when you look at the box, the shaded boxes there, the darker box shows the performance of the lowest quartile of closed hospitals. So you can see these organizations really performed quite poorly for an extended period of time. Again, the blue line is the median for closed hospitals. And then the lighter shaded box is the top quartile of closed hospitals. And I think one cautionary note, and I think this explains why the North Carolina folks really focused on the last 2 years for their analysis, is the top quartile of hospitals that closed prior to 2 years prior to closure, their performance fairly closely mimicked the median for open hospitals. So there's a fair amount of noise here that we need to take into account. But you can see the differential between closed and open starts really to substantially widen, really starting in year -3 and widening more as we move closer to closure. Again, our concern is 2 years prior to closure doesn't give folks a lot of runway. Last point I'll make before we move on from this slide. I know that's a lot of information. There's a lot of data in this slide. The shaded area you see near -8 to year -4 really became the focus area of our study because we started asking ourselves, if I'm a member of the C-suite or I'm a member of a hospital board, what should I be looking at to give myself early enough warning to take steps to really prevent the most acute risk from impacting our organization. And we felt that waiting longer than 4 years prior to a future closure date didn't give an organization enough runway. So we decided to particularly zero in on the performance of closed and open hospitals in year -8 to year -4, looking at both the absolute levels of performance, but also the relative change in performance across key metrics. And we'll come back to that construct later. So a lot of information here, and I think what you'll see is how we start to unpack that and make that more actionable and insightful for hospital leaders. With that, I want to turn it over to Amy to walk you through some additional key points.
So in thinking about these hospitals, that you have them looking at that period, year -4 to year -8, and then what happened after that in years number -3 to that the year we started looking at, there are worst case outcomes, but there are also best case outcomes. The worst case outcome is that the hospital closes, that you have closure in your community, you no longer have that organization to support the members. If you're heading toward the best case scenario, though, another option that could potentially happen to these hospitals is that they have a bad partner. They decide we need a partner. We're having a fire sale. Yes, we get into this partnership agreement with them, and it's a bad partner that doesn't, have the best interest of the community at heart. Looking at that, if you just stay in the middle and no changes are made, they stay open, but maybe in a strategic drift, that they're in a purgatory of sorts where they're not in a bad partnership, they're not in a good partnership, they're not thriving, they're not closed, they're just existing within the community. If we continue going to the right, though, there are opportunities in looking at that -year 4 to -year 8 to say, what if we join with a good partner or a good partnership? What does that look like? Making those plans, looking forward to the future, and getting into that arrangement. By looking at that time frame, it sets enough runway to be able to establish that and bring that into fruition. Or really, the best case scenario is that the hospital is thriving. There's an independence within the community, a thriving independence or interdependence within a system that they're in. But that's the best case scenario. And as we get into the presentation, what we're going to share with you are some things to look at, strategies to address, areas to focus on, and do that. And then also, it's like, okay, Amy, Jeff, you're giving us all this good information, but does it really work? Or are you just, spouting off? We actually do have a case study that Jeff will be sharing with you at the end of this presentation to say, here's someone who identified it 4 years, 8 years prior. They were at a strategic risk, but now they have turned it around and become a very thriving, independent facility out there in their community and even in their state. So if we look at the next slide, you actually have different risk factors that have been identified as part of the study. The first one being, as everyone would think, top line revenue growth, bringing in that revenue, but then also looking to how that falls down to the bottom line. What is your operating margin and cash flow rate? When we look at a future slide, though, we're going to share with you, though, that operating and margin and cash flow isn't necessarily managing by cutting expenses. In some critical access hospitals, your margins are so tight that any new revenue that comes in really feeds to that and helps bring that in. We're going to look at some liquidity measures, looking at liquidity measures as well as the other focuses that are out there. But in looking at this improved performance, the areas looking at, if you look on the right-hand side, we're going to focus over there. Strawwater has done nearly 30 rural improvement projects with hospitals at risk out there. And what we have identified is that 33.2% reduction in out migration helps turn this hospital to being a thriving organization. And looking at other areas to focus on are perhaps in the revenue cycle service line, managing your denials, managing simple areas of just timely filing of billing, working in those things, looking at service line growth, expansion, what's happening in your marketplace, swing bed growth. We do have 340B listed. The 340B program right now is in a lot of flux. So, in talking internally, we're sort of like, maybe we wait until the dust settles to focus on 340B so much as an improved performance measure or a way to improve performance. But it does add some opportunities out there, as well as cost reports, opportunities, and then other areas. Looking on the left-hand side, one of the things we'd like to share is that when putting these engagements into place, that the median percent the median impact in net patient revenue that we saw for these hospitals was nearly an 8% growth. So looking at that, what does that equate to? On the 25th percentile side, on the 25th percent, you see $1.3 million added to that net patient services revenue, with a high for some organizations in the 75th percentile at $3.7 million. So, looking at these opportunities, that reduction in out migration, what is going on in your marketplace, in your community, and focusing on how do we keep the services local, meeting your needs of your community, and what that looks like. So at this point, we're going to get to a polling question. So we actually have a polling question for you. And our first polling question is, wait for that to fire off. Thank you. How important do you believe the improved operating results are to the future viability of your organization? The votes are still coming in. Give it another 10 seconds. All right, let's go ahead and share the results. So you can see that 69% of you say that it's very important. 28% are extremely important, whereas 28% say they're very important. And so, Jeff, I'm going to hand it back over to you to let you actually share what we found within the study for the results on how important the operating results are.
Yeah, I'm very pleased to see that folks are focused on operational performance as a really critical risk mitigation strategy. So I think that response, I would personally very much agree and endorse how people responded to that. So looking at some additional data, this is looking at operating cash flow margin. So really taking out things like tax support or performance of investments, really looking at how the core operation performed. Again, same construct as I shared earlier. And you can see that, long-term stable operating cash flow margin is kind of a marker of the median performance of rural hospitals that remained open, where they'd been running at about, 8 to 9.5% on a median basis. but you can see the median performance of the rural hospitals that closed lagged significantly beneath that and then significantly deteriorated again 2 years prior to closure. And again, the risk of waiting until you get there is you don't have enough runway. But we also recognize that there's noise in the data. Again, you look at the top quartile of rural hospitals that closed, and they performed quite well relative to the meeting that was open. But here's where I believe the data is helpful. If we look at the trend line, the compound annual growth rate of median operating cash flow for closed rural hospitals versus open rural hospitals, and we'll present this data in a little bit more depth, the trend line for closed is a negative 20% rate, going from 2.3% in year -8 down to 0.7% in year -4. That's a very significant decline, and I think is a key marker, in addition to kind of the disparity between the medians. So that type of analysis, we think, starts to get at some actionable data for members of C-suite, members of boards. This is another key metric that certainly turnarounds often focus on. So this is for organizations that have negative cash flow. And it's looking at how rapidly, given that negative cash flow, would that consumption of cash deplete investments and reserves. And the median for hospitals, rural hospitals that remained open when they experience negative cash flow is, you can see, it's 2.5 years, 2.5+ years for most of the time period in question, versus the median for rural hospitals is consistently less than a year and obviously drops even further as you get closer to closure. So understanding what this looks like, it's a combination of operating results and, in this case, not having adequate cash on the reserves, so on your balance sheet. So again, you see a very consistent dynamic between these two metrics. And again, this focuses only on those organizations that either remained open or closed that had negative cash flow during this period of time. So I referenced these various metrics and how comparing year -8 to year -4 and looking at the trend in that time period starts to reveal, I think, some meaningful and actionable data and differences that do become important for C-suite. You can see here in the columns that are in that orangish color, the variance in trend, where the median performance for closed hospitals is consistently negative relative to the trend for the median hospitals that remained open. Again, this is all rural hospitals. And cash flow margin, the trend is at 20 percentage point different in terms of the relative trajectory there. All of those are negative. But if you look at the 4 years prior to closure, and this is where we would suggest that if I'm a board, I would want to take the temperature of my organization against year -4, and say, where do we fall relative to the median for open and closed? And where does the 5-year prior trajectory, that trend, fall relative to closed and open? Again, with an important caveat, the top quartile of rural hospitals that closed in much of the period -4 to 8 across many of these metrics closely mimicked the performance of open hospitals. So it's really important to dig into the data, really look at some of the strategic indicators, and look at qualitative risk factors as well. Things like, hey, is our medical staff, is it aging? Is it more depleted? Like we're doing okay, but if I look across key members of that medical staff, they're aging, we're not renewing that medical staff. That would be a strategic risk factor that could very well rear its head in the next few years and create significant difficulty. But this gives any organization, any rural organization, the ability to benchmark itself. Some additional metrics here. Similar story with two caveats. The cash run rate, because there was such a huge disparity in the absolute levels, actually the median for closed actually ticked up modestly, going from 6 to 7 months between years -8 and -4. Again, a bit of an outlier there. The other one that I don't have an explanation for, but service area population. Again, the median for organizations that closed actually had some modest growth population wise versus the median for organizations that remained open saw some modest negative population trend. My takeaway there is that population trend is not a factor in a 5 year period that's really going to move the needle significantly in risk. But I think the absolute difference in population and certainly market share is a factor that does contribute significantly to risk. But again, more, I think, informative data that helps organizations understand their relative risk profile. So significant variances between closed and open hospitals. Again, you have this top quartile of closed that creates a bit of noise there. And I think it's a cautionary note. Just because your performance may be aligned or closely mimic the median for open does not mean you are completely out of the woods. That's one of the takeaways. There is a cohort of closed rural hospitals that actually looked pretty good up until 2 years prior to closure, and some may have looked even better longer than that. Relative size and growth are critical risk mitigation factors. The data supports that. Size based upon net patient service revenue and growth based upon trend in net patient service revenue. Market retention, reducing outmigration is a significant factor. And again, you can see the trend in market share between open and closed hospitals, combined with the difference in the size of the markets they serve, obviously contributing to risk there. Amy.
So, in thinking about it, you've got this strategic risk framework, but what are those factors that actually impact that strategic risk? And so, what we have on the left hand side are the four domains that we see: financial, operational, value, and market. And that poor performance in one domain will have a collateral spillover effect to the other. So if you don't have that market share or you're not providing value, you won't have the market. And so you really want to work together with this and help your board appreciate the cumulative effects of changes in risk factors. That if we focus too much on one area, how that can impact your organization over time. So that leads us up to polling question number 2. So our polling question number 2 that we have out there is, how would you describe your organization's strategic risk profile? Low, moderate, elevated, high, unsure.
And I was going to say, while we're waiting for results to come in our experience, many boards don't actually spend time, on an annual basis or any other cadence, really looking at this and asking themselves what the risk profile is and how it has changed. I'll be curious if the polling results support that um, assessment.
I think we can give it about 5 more seconds. 5, 4. All right. So it looks as if the majority of the respondents are either unsure or a moderate risk out there, Jeff, with 18% being at elevated risk and 9% being a high risk. So, there are some strategic risks out there. And when just really thinking about that, and how do you take from, what do you take from this? How can you continue forward? In looking at the next slide, one of the things that we've done are just helping you understand some key markers for closure out there. So when thinking about your market share, your net patient services revenue, looking at total margin and operating cash flow, what are those trends? What are the levels? How are you looking today and saying, where do I fall within that -4 to -8 year period? What does that look like? Looking at your cash flow versus your current liabilities with the short term outcome, your cash run rate, And then what is that risk? Do you have a strategic risk and a closure risk out there? When looking at it, we've done some analysis and come up with some stratification of this risk between different organizations. And so, when looking at these hospitals, some risk factors that we see are that 22% of rural hospitals are at a high risk of hospital closure. And the things leading into this are negative operating margin, your total margins overall, minimal revenue growth, declines in market share, and negatively trending equity. When looking at 40% of the hospitals are at an elevated risk, where you have modest operating total margins, low or slightly negative cash flow, stagnant equity trends, and nominal changes to market share. But then 37% of the hospitals are at a moderate risk. And this is looking at hospitals that have positive operating total margins, positive cash flows, revenue growth trends above 3.1%. So when thinking about it, your risk can be, you can fall into one of these buckets. But when you have that runway of -4 years to -8 years, looking at what you are doing and how you are focusing on it can lead to strategically avoiding closure and becoming a thriving organization and moving the needle forward. Some lessons that we've learned from these hospitals are that open rural hospitals with less than 300 beds that were examined for the strategic risk or risk of closure, that 39.5% of them had negative operating margins in 2024. But 23% of those hospitals were successful in mitigating their risk trajectory between 2019 and 2024. So, when thinking about this, there is the opportunity. All is not lost when you look at it and say, our hospital has been classified as an at risk hospital. That 23% of the time, hospitals were successfully able to mitigate that risk trajectory, grow their organization, and then continue thriving in their community. It does say that we did show, though, that there was 77% of the hospitals that could not materially reduce that strategic risk, but it is possible. Sometimes when you're alone and you're out there and you're in your rural facility and you're thinking, where's my next nearest peer? They're over 100 miles away. Is anybody else experiencing what I'm experiencing? Can I get out of this? And the message I want to leave with you, and I would say Jeff resonates with it, is that it is possible that when looking at this, but there is a strategic mindset that you and your organization have to see to mitigate that risk. So with that, I think I get all the polling questions, don't I, Jeff? We're up to our
You
polling
sure do.
question number 3. So our polling question number 3 really thinks about your board. Does your board have a good understanding of your organization's strategic risk profile and how it has changed in the last 5 years? And I
While
would
you guys
say,
are
oh, go
answering,
ahead.
oh, excuse me, Amy, just want to say we are going to have a Q&A session at the end of this presentation. So we already have a couple of questions coming in. There's a Q&A function in Zoom there on the bottom. In mine, it's on the little under more. But feel free to put in your questions now, and we'll get to them when we get to that part.
All right. And I think we're getting close to sharing the results of the poll. So we can see that these answers too are stratified between a clear and current understanding and a fair understanding of data. That's about 50% of the attendees here, whereas we've got about another 45% saying we've never evaluated or discussed the organization's strategic risk profile, or you're unsure about that. So when thinking about these questions, one of the messages that we hear and that resonated through this is just having a strategic view, that you actually have to step out of the day-to-day blocking and tackling, but really focus on what does your runway look like for the next 8 to 10 years. What can you do to mitigate that? And so, with that, Jeff, we're going to share a real life example of Mahaska Health Partners and their case study there.
Great. Thank you, Amy. So Mahaska Health is in Southeast Iowa. They're a county-owned facility, and they were struggling in 2017. They were actually on USDA's kind of list of troubled or at-risk credits. And they had a real choice given that challenge. Play it safe and pull back, or look to be taken over and lose independence. Certainly nationally, we see a lot of organizations that have taken we're going to trim our sails, we're going to cut and try to get to some sustainable threshold. I think for smaller organizations, for rural organizations, for critical access hospitals, that strategy is a problematic one. And my colleagues, Eric Schell and Dan Given and others during this conference will speak to that in the kind of financial and operational blocking and tackling. But Mahaska decided to do something different, and they were faced with a similar question when facing the pandemic a few years later. Should they bank the PPP and COVID relief funds or use that to invest in care delivery? And in both instances, Mahaska made the decision, no, we're going to focus on growth. And so this comparison, 2019 to 2024, you can see significant revenue growth from 52 million in net patient service revenue to 95 million. Operating margin significantly improved. Able to invest in the organization, increase net assets very significantly, and reverse a market share trend. And so they invested in growth. And one of the ways that manifested themselves is invested in their people. Rather than bank the PPP COVID relief fund, they gave every nurse in the organization a $5 per hour increase. And that helped reduce their reliance upon contract nursing when a lot of organizations really, really struggled. They recruited an extensive number of providers, which you think about a rural hospital starting off with $50 million worth of net patient service revenue, and over the next 6, 7 years, recruiting 84 providers. That's a really extraordinary investment over that time period. Consumed a lot of cash and cash flow on ramping those providers up. They built out infrastructure, and one of their key investments has been on informatics and analyzing data and analytics and really partnering with their clinicians to prioritize opportunities. And now they're really looking at deploying AI solutions and revenue cycle and provider charting to assist the organization going forward. So the keys to the strategy, first of all, they did have to make some changes. They needed to get director level buy-in. Not everybody was on the same page, and so there was some change in management and leadership level. But importantly, they identified new leaders who were on message and aligned. And as part of that process, they created a whole core cohort of clinician leaders, physician and nurse leaders. They have 18 medical directors and nurse leaders who participate on the executive team, such that it's the providers that are really problem solving and bringing their concerns and opportunities to the table. And then the team is trying to figure out how can we operationalize that, improve care, and improve workflows. They've invested significantly in people. They had 26 open positions, and as organizations around them were eliminating positions and laying people off during the pandemic, they were able to fill those positions from those organizations. And I mentioned the raises and the investment they made in their nursing workforce during the pandemic, which was not an easy decision to make, but was really on strategy and really on culture, if you will, for that organization and the direction they were going in. Their consistent focus on top line revenue growth was just essential. So everything they did was through that lens. We're not going to cut our way to sustainability. We're going to grow our way to sustainability. And that manifested itself in various service lines, significant investment in obstetrics and labor and delivery, significant investment while neighboring organizations in the region were eliminating their labor and delivery programs. So really swimming upstream and bucking the trend, really making significant investments in oncology. And that's manifesting itself in recognition and accreditations and really a very robust service alignment within oncology going forward. But ultimately, they had the right strategy, but they also really focused on making sure that they were enhancing and moving towards their ideal culture. And that wasn't necessarily where they started out, but they made that a key part of their journey. And you can see the results here. They've really been recognized, and their employee engagement and buy-in really reflects the success they've had. And their leadership team would absolutely say the two best things we did as an organization was one, focusing on what they call and we call an abundance mindset, which is growth over cutting back. And the second thing was investing in their people and their culture. And that really facilitated what they did. A couple things specifically. One of the things they did early on is they basically flipped their organizational chart. Most organizational charts have the board of directors and then the C-suite on top. And what they did is said, no, no, on top for us, and the most important thing are our patients and their families. And then uh, next to that or underneath that are our caregivers, the people who actually touch the experience, the clinical quality and the customer service and just the caring experience within the organization, whether they be patient care providers or other folks that impact that patient and family experience. And at the bottom was the C-suite. And it sounds like a gimmick, but it's not a gimmick if the organization lives it and the leadership team embraces that. And so they really focused on empowering their people and talent, partnering with clinicians and aligning with those clinicians, and as a leadership team, being accessible. This is a quote, serving is the art and act of focusing on someone else's interest instead of your own. This kind of servant leadership, I think, is a more commonly heard term. The leadership team really embraced that and made that kind of a cornerstone of their culture and their actions going forward. And as I mentioned, this creating and empowering clinical leaders and the caregivers as partners in this enterprise and really working with them as these are the experts in the clinical experience, the patient care experience. Let's make sure we're supporting that and yes, analyzing and assessing. Not everything is a yes, but if it's not a yes, that's got to be a really valid reason why not, just as opposed to it's not our idea, it's somebody else's idea. So where they are now, all of their challenges, I shouldn't say all, many of their challenges are factors of their own success, managing growth, kind of building out the infrastructure to handle the growth. And there are challenges, really payer challenges, looking at that. So Medicaid directed payment has been delayed and kind of unsettled. They need to add capacity both in the ORs and clinic space, but they're facing the same Medicaid cuts that a lot of our fellow organizations are, and commercial payers that are really ratcheting down payment. And so they've got insurers like many of us that are using AI to really increase denials and delay payment. All of that's been a challenge. But the opportunities are the flip side of that. You start to see the recognition of the investments they've made, both in terms of service delivery, but also in terms of quality, and really being able to enhance those services. We talked about cancer. They've done some really important work on diagnostics and labor and delivery and women's health. They've enhanced their surgical and proceduralist capabilities, general surgeons, urologists. And we talked about oncology, obviously. So one of the things they benefited from is regionally, and some distance from them, there's a regional for-profit competitor that's just been in turmoil, and they're starting to see reverse migration from that regional referral center that's in a larger metro area out towards Mahaska. People recognizing that they're doing something special, and that it's really both from an employee and a patient perspective and a provider perspective. People are kind of seeking them out as a great place to be. So really a fascinating case study, and I think a great example of an organization that was at risk and really moving to a very, they've got a set of risks, but they're a very different set of risks. And if we looked objectively at their balance sheet and income statement and their market position, as Amy's construct shared, we would find them in a much improved position. So with that, there's some key takeaways that I think Amy and I wanted to share with you. Amy, I don't know if you want to walk us through these.
I'm happy to. So, really, when thinking about these lessons that we've learned, is that operational performance is essential to mitigating strategic risk and preserving your strategic options. Where do you take it? Time is never neutral factor. 2 years is needed to execute a time and execute a turnaround. So when thinking about it, when looking at it now, where do you look in the next 2 years, 4 years, 8 years? How can you use that runway that you have in front of you to mitigate that risk? The next one, know your risk profile. Risk markers for closure are evident 4 to 5 years prior to closure. I talked to one CEO one day and she's like, I operate every day like tomorrow we're going to close the doors. And that's true. But when thinking about that, what is your risk profile? And there are no risk free strategic options. Sound operating results are essential. And then finally, early action saves hospitals. The sooner you alter the course, the less drastic the course correction required. You have time today to mitigate the risk. All is not lost, and you can make those changes and turn your organization around. So, with that,
That's great.
Yep.
oh, go ahead, Jeff.
I
We
was
want
just going to say that's a great summary, Amy. And what I was going to say was the time is never a neutral factor. If it takes 2 years to execute a turnaround, remember that if you're looking at market share and financial performance, those are lagging indicators. You typically won't have that information in final form for months after the year in question is been experienced. That then cuts into your 2 year lead time. It also means that if something is delayed or goes wrong, that also is a problem. Lastly, some of the initiatives you may need to execute a turnaround can take the entire 2 years. They may be consuming cash for that entire 2 years. When you think about provider recruitment, there's the lead time before you can get the provider to your community, and then there's the ramp up time. So if you wait until you have 2 years left, part of the strategy might actually make operating performance worse during that 2 year time period because that's the investment time, and the rewards start occurring after that. So when we say 2 years is needed to execute a turnaround, it's really the bare minimum. That's why we focus on that 4 year result. Thinking about if you're an organization now, imagine yourself, you've got 4 years prior to closure. How do you compare to the median for open? What did the prior 5 year trend look like relative to median for open? And what does that tell you about your risk profile? That will give you adequate time to implement a performance improvement plan and realize the benefits of that before you run out of runway in most instances. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to make sure we got that in there.
All right, Jeff, the orchestra is starting to play, unfortunately. So no, we want to have some time for Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and ask those. So the first is a two-part question. First, in that -4 to -1 window, is the problem fundamentally a volume and structural problem, or is there enough addressable recurring revenue still on the table that a few points of margin recovery actually changes the trajectory? So that's the first question.
I think that unfortunately the answer is it depends. But I think the question hits at a key point, and I think it's a valid point that if you start earlier, you do have time to look at growth strategies, even growth strategies that are going to take time to realize and come to fruition, as opposed to being at such a point where we're just cutting to try to conserve cash so we can make payroll 3 months from now, 2 months from now, et cetera. Those are very different scenarios. And that's why you want to move earlier where there is more opportunity to add volume, that incremental volume that will make a huge difference from a contribution margin perspective, even for organizations where 50% of their revenue is cost based. So I think the question is a great question and really hints at why delay is such a dangerous factor for members of the C-suite.
And then the second was where would technology-enabled revenue capture rank against the structural levers for a hospital that's already inside that decline window versus one that's still sitting at a healthy median?
I, I think it should absolutely be one of the initiatives or potential priorities that's studied. When our operational performance and improvement team goes on site and works with an organization, they're doing a diagnostic and an assessment that then feeds into action planning. And that diagnostic assessment and action planning is all about identifying the unique factors and unique opportunities for that organization that can make a difference. The technology enabled revenue growth could absolutely be one of those priority areas. And then the action planning, what that does is let's create the accountability and the timeline behind that if it is one of the priorities. So I think it can certainly be a priority for an organization, but those priorities are very organization specific. As Amy talked about in her slide, I think the key point I would say, regardless of the specific initiatives, is a growth strategy, and looking at growth as opposed to, expense reduction is important, but that's not going to get you where you want to be. Thinking about Mahaska, for instance, they had a choice to make. They focused on growth, not expense reduction by itself.
Um, William asks, your initial grid discussed CAH and good versus bad partnerships. Can you weigh in on CAH and rural hospitals that are working hard to maintain independence? That says we are financially strong presently and work hard at it.
Amy, I've been answering the questions. Do you want to jump in there or do you want me to jump in on that one?
I was going to say, it is a struggle out there, and in having that good partnership, if a partnership is an avenue that you choose to go down, then having the ability to find the partner that works best for you and your organization, rather than just finding someone who, for lack of a better description, is a bottom feeder wanting to buy someone at a fire sale, but really someone that will partner with you to strategically keep, that healthcare in your community and managing that piece of it. I was going to say, Jeff, I find it interesting that you gave me the question, but this is something you deal with day in and day out. So
Well,
thinking about it.
yeah, I felt bad because I was jumping in and not giving you a chance, so I apologize. What I would just say, and adding to that, Amy, is, you know, um, I do think, and Amy talked about this, the ideal state is a thriving, independent or interdependent organization. And I would say, when I say interdependent, or we say interdependent, we're talking about a locally governed, locally owned. That is, you could have a partner, but it might be clinical. In nature, you've got a couple of service lines that you're partnering with a tertiary provider on to enhance service delivery in your community, but you're still independent. So that would be an example of thriving interdependence. Another example that I think too few rural hospitals are looking at strategically is if there is an FQHC in your market, is there a way to collaborate that can enhance both organizations? There are some great models out there. And so let me just caveat this by saying we understand that in some markets, the relationship with the local FQHC is highly dysfunctional and toxic and has just got every nature of problem to it. But what we've seen in some markets is FQHC hospital partnership that can be really important to sustainability of key clinical programs like labor and delivery, but also more broadly speaking, sustaining a primary care base. And really helping out both organizations be better than they could be alone and be better than they will be if they're duplicating and competing services. So I think that's what Amy was talking about. There are a range of options. You don't necessarily have to do a traditional partnership. And I would encourage, if you're doing well and want to remain independent, exploring those to see, can they fill some of the gaps. Conversely, if an organization is losing altitude, you're in that strategic purgatory place and you're not making progress, there can be advantages to not waiting until you're absolutely in a fire sale situation. And then you really want to use whatever leverage you have to find the right partner and the right terms and the right structure that's going to protect your community and ensure they have access to services. Because as Amy talked about in that slide, there's a lot of examples of bad partnerships, and we spend a lot of our time trying to keep our clients out of those situations.
I mean,
Yeah,
and I would say, Jeff, too, it's easier to look for a partner when you're, or to entertain the idea of a partnership with someone when you are thriving than when you're struggling to make your next payroll.
that's well said.
To have that opportunity, there's no one that says you have to sign with that partner, but you can always entertain the discussion and always say no. You're not obligated to say yes, but have that discussion.
Very great. There's a bunch more questions. We don't have time to respond to those, but we will answer them individually off after the session ends. We'll make sure that all of those questions get answered by our panelists. Thank you very much for Jeff and Amy for helping to frame the realities that rural hospitals are facing and highlighting the practical pathways towards sustainability and long-term resilience that they're taking. So as a reminder, when you exit today's session, you're going to receive a brief survey pop-up. We really appreciate your feedback. It should take less than 1 minute, and it helps us continue shaping the future conference programming. When the session ends, you're going to automatically be brought back to the virtual library. If you're joining us for the next session, just go ahead and when you get to the lobby, you can click into the next session from the agenda. And we're going to begin at the top of the hour with the future of rural healthcare strategies for success. And we will see you soon.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Keith. Thanks all for joining us. Thank you, Amy.
Bye.
Thank you.